Techlandia is recorded at the Central Office on the East Side in Portland. Central Office is a one-stop for all your office or meeting needs. Check them out at centraloffice.com. Welcome to Techlandia, a podcast about and for the technology industry, a place to learn, connect, and engage with leaders and thinkers involved in the technology industry. You can check us out at techoregon.org, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome to the latest episode of Techlandia, TAO's regular podcast series. I'm Skip Newberry, President and CEO. And with us today, we have Martin Medeiros. Martin, so glad you could join us today.
Thanks, Skip. Appreciate the invite, and I'm excited to chat today.
Yeah, I am too. You're an expert in all legal matters, as well as specifically negotiation. And I know we'll spend some time talking more about some of the nuances when it comes to negotiation in the tech context, including in procurement issues. But I wanted to start first by asking you to maybe share a little bit about your professional journey with our listeners.
All right. I guess, well, early on in high school, I actually was always fascinated by technology. I did some coding, and I in a language called Fortran, which I read in a book the other day. It said Fortran, comma, an ancient language. So I think it's been around a lot, and then got into BASIC and other things, and now I'm learning a little bit. So technology I've always been fascinated by it. My first computer was an Apple II in like 77, I guess, and then I started just getting interested in law and went to law school. And I was hired as a legal intern with American Airlines in their flight reservation system called Sabre Technology Group, which Sabre means Semi-Automated Business Research Environment, SABRE. It was a joint development between American Airlines and IBM, and I basically negotiated procurement contracts from during law school to the present. And I to see about other companies, I started going to the Society for Information Managers Technology Procurement Group and did that for about a decade. And then I got into private practice. I was in-house at some Fortune 500 companies, and then worked for an AmLaw 100 law firm. And then now I'm in private practice. And about 25 years ago, I started teaching people how to do it, how to negotiate transactions, primarily technology transactions. And I've actually written 6 books since then. And I have a podcast called The Persuasion Lab with Martin Medeiros, and we talk about all types of negotiation, not just tech. We have hostage negotiators, people who negotiate with terrorists, people who negotiate just transactions, attorneys, people who talk about the psychological side of negotiation. So that's kind of my journey on how I started this. And during COVID, I developed a curriculum for university and did some research on kind of corporate training and what makes it sticky, what makes it more valuable. We could talk about that later, but that's kind of how I got into this space of negotiating technology transactions.
Excellent. I earlier in my career, I remember I was on a phone call. I was working for a company. We were trying to make a sale, and the person we were talking to was kind of the key decision maker. And as we got farther along in negotiations, I remember distinctly him saying, hey, if you include this one concession, it allows me to avoid bringing legal in. And Lord knows those attorneys, they're just speed bumps on the road to progress. And in other words, he was trying to say, let's get the deal done now. I don't want to involve legal. But I'm wondering what are some of the like common sort of easily avoidable mistakes that you see people make when they're thinking about procurement in the technology space?
There's a lot of areas that I think, and I guess I'll pick the big one that I see a lot of, and that is, um, in your example, you don't want to, they want you to sign their form contract because if they sign it as is, legal review is like 30 seconds.
Right.
But if you start negotiating stuff, then it becomes problematic. And I always say negotiate everything. Negotiate your house contract, negotiate everything because everything is negotiable. And some of the clauses get in there and they are artifacts from other deals, from a bygone error, and they really don't apply. So yeah, read your contracts, and if you have a problem, see if they've done something. My third book is called, what's it called? 161 Negotiation Tactics. And we polled 60 people who self-identified as professional negotiators, defined as we spend more than 50% of our day negotiating deals. And the vast majority of them were technology negotiators. They said the number one tactic is the open-ended question. How would that work? If you see a clause you don't like, or even a price you don't like, don't put something out there. See if they're willing to give you something. And an open-ended question would be like, hey, I saw this payment term clause. It's very aggressive. Is that the best you can do? You see what I did there? I didn't give them, I want, net 15 days. You see a lot of Fortune 500 companies pushing that date out where they want to pay, they want you to get paid 45 days, sometimes 60 days. I've even seen 90 days after, which basically you're being your customer's bank. And that's hard for a lot of companies, especially newer technology, kind of in the startup space. So you really want to get that payment term and that open-ended question, what's the best you can do? Something like that. So that's one way. And on the concession thing, what I just tell people is never make what I call a naked concession. Never give up something unless there's some reciprocity, something coming back. And you can do that on, well, every programmer should know an if-then statement. If I do this, then what will you do for me? Perfectly appropriate to ask that in a technology contract, because technology contracts, a lot of them very hard to implement, unforeseen things can go wrong. And the implementation time is never as aggressive as we would like it to be.
That's really a good point too that you made, kind of about the former example where using an open-ended question. You don't want to negotiate against yourself. Let someone else maybe surprise you with an even longer, or even bigger concession, right? That they might be willing to give than you would have otherwise asked them.
Yeah, absolutely right.
That's great.
Even
I was thinking in the as you were thinking about like payment terms and duration. One thing that I've seen a lot in, especially custom software development projects, is the installment contract, where you're asked to agree to payment in successive terms. Could be 3 or whatever, 3 installments. Like, what are some of the issues you see when it comes to installment contracts in the technology space?
I think that the biggest problem is objective criteria upon which payment is triggered. Of course, the if I'm buying software, I want a lot of wiggle room. I just want to feel good. I want to make sure it operates, and you can specify those operating statistics and KPIs and all that stuff. And I really encourage people to look at things that are objective. The worst thing you can do is step up to a flawless type of technology deployment. At least you should always carve out non-reproducible errors. I mean, every person hates these things. When something happens to one person, or it happens, intermittently, there's no pattern to it. Well, if it's a serious pattern, then that shows an engineering issue. But if it's kind of a one-off, you want to make sure that in your criteria for acceptance, you want to make sure that, if it's a pattern or a cluster of something happening, that's a problem. But if it's an anomalous thing that happens, then that should be good enough for acceptance. If you're the technology seller, if you're the purchaser, of course, you want this stuff to work. And there's a standard, a legal standard we talk about. It's kind of fuzzy, but the law is sometimes fuzzy. It's called materiality. And you know this, Skip, because you have a JD. If there's a material problem with something where it undermines the whole of the contract, it just simply doesn't work. It doesn't do the money I'm paying you for. I'm trying to solve a problem. I'm putting resources at it, and it's not even doing that. Well, that's a material part of the contract. We have this standard called also substantial performance, where if someone more or less gets most of the stuff right, then that's good enough for contract performance. All things being equal, you can put materiality provisions and everything. And if it's very important to the contract, talk to your attorney. They will recommend that you really emphasize those things that are the most important. If time of delivery, the magic words are time is of the essence, that means you have to make the deadline, and things like that. So there are ways to get around it, but on the installment contracts in particular, for each tranche payment, you really need to be specific on what will trigger that acceptance. Typically, you see something like, module one's going to go out. You'll have 5, 10, however many days to accept it, to drill on it. If it works, we'll do a bug fix. If it comes back and there's something we can do, then we'll fix it. If you don't say anything, then that's automatic acceptance. So the issue is, some of these modules can go out there for acceptance and they languish. Well, again, nothing I say should be interpreted as legal advice. Talk to your attorney. That's my disclaimer. But I do think when it comes to acceptance criteria, you have something where if it languishes, you got to get paid. And if they're sitting on it for months, then that's conditional. That's acceptance as far as I'm concerned.
So I wanted to go back a little bit to when you mentioned boilerplate in contracts, and how people often overlook that section and think, oh, that's not even negotiable. It's just, it's boilerplate. Why would I even take a look at it? What are some areas that you think are ones that folks should pay particular attention to, especially startups, where in the boilerplate, they could end up with some terms that down the road, if something goes sideways, could subject them to some serious expense?
Yeah, I think some of the things that drive cost and expense are, some of the contracts that you see as a default in kind of more aggressive, less aggressive. One thing I think, if things totally, what's the biggest risk? Things totally go sideways. Someone was injured by the deployment or something happens, and there's an indemnity clause, right? So indemnity basically, there's 3 parts to it, I like to think of. So indemnity is, hey, if you give me something defective, you're going to stand in my shoes and defend me legally and make it good. And that's great. But if it's like a co-development project, or if both parties have skin in the game, you want a mutual indemnity, meaning we want both sides to cover the losses, the bad acts that they create. And out of the gate, most form contracts have a very one-sided indemnity clause that basically assumes the drafter is always right and the person who signs it is always wrong. And that's just not the case. And that's usually most companies will cave in. The second part of this kind of high risk clauses in contracts has to do with damages limitation. Without any limit, the damages for that transaction could be limitless. And the way you do that, you see these typical clauses where damages will be limited to 1 year's revenue as a reasonable estimate of damages if anything goes wrong. You don't want to insure or pay or indemnify for all the subsequent bad stuff that can happen. For example, American Airlines, we would have people in the data center. This is a true story where, well, I don't know if it's true. It's lore, I guess, but you can drop a wrench on a conduit and then the flight reservation system can go down. And that costs, millions of dollars every minute for an airline. So what's the limit of damages for that? That would be something probably less. And there's a lot of things where one act can cause a cascading effect of bad stuff. So if you're a technology provider, you will be subject to your intentional acts, gross negligence, maybe even regular negligence, depending on the contract. But you want to make sure that, hey, this is a known, quantifiable, and third part, insurable risk. So whatever you're doing, whatever risk you're creating, you will need insurance. So remember, we talked about indemnity, which is like the promise to make good. Well, some of these smaller companies, they're undercapitalized and you will not have the resources to make good. So you will need, and the purchaser should say, you need some type of insurance. And generally, if it's professional services, you're talking about errors and omissions insurance, which is something I think, attorneys and doctors know about it. It's kind of like malpractice. But I carry errors and omissions insurance, say, for teaching, because I want to make sure that when I'm doing it, people are saying, hey, I did that negotiation thing and it didn't work out and I lost all this money and it's your fault. So you want to say, no, this is learning. It's not, we're not going to be suing people over it. So those are some of the things that we think about when those are big contract terms that you should read carefully, because in the absence of anything else, they can be super one-sided. I don't want to do a whole contract review, but there's so many different things that I would like go down a list, a checklist. And on my website, thepersuasionlab.com, we have a bunch of content checklists. I call them deal points, where it's almost like a negotiation script. Oh, these things I should look at or have a discussion about when I'm reviewing this contract.
And I think also, you made a really interesting point about just how interrelated some of the different types of agreements can be as it relates to, say, a contract for goods or services. It might implicate your employment agreements. It might implicate your relationships with insurance providers, as you've just highlighted. So a contract can quickly spiderweb into all sorts of areas within your company where you need to go back and make sure that you're covered. In other words, I'm wondering on the indemnity question, when it comes to the source of code, for example, for a software company, when you're talking about doing a deal with a large, say, heavily regulated entity, oftentimes there might be a provision that you indemnify that all the or you warranty that all the code was specifically developed in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of companies, especially startups, are often like, well, sure. How seriously should companies really take that? And are there certain sort of admonitions that you would put out there for companies that might risk taking that too lightly?
Yeah, um I have, I've been practicing law for 30 years, and never underestimate the probability of simultaneous development. For one thing, calculus was actually developed by two people simultaneously, one in England, one in Germany, almost the same time. Well, I've literally had trademarks that were filed hours apart, and first in time wins. The second one will get rejected. But these two people, for the same good and service, had a very similar name, and they both filed it with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, and they were just hours apart. So how do you ensure that your code is totally pure? It's something you worked on. Well, first of all, make sure it's, the source of it. Was it from a contractor, an employee, which there's different legal things about transferring. We won't get into that administrivia on the law, but we will talk about how much diligence do you have in knowing the source of that code. What we often do, if we don't know or we can't really step up, we have a knowledge qualifier. To the best of our knowledge, we don't know that there's any prior claim, or this was developed by foreign agents or something, which, it's kind of probably some pushback on that, but that knowledge qualifier is used in a lot of technology, because you see a lot of these clauses where you have to basically claim to have knowledge of the universe, that what you're making, what you're delivering no one else has done, in 8 billion people on planet Earth. And that's a really big warranty representation to step up to. And most contracts have some type of qualifier. The biggest technology companies will not step up to that warranty, because there's so much out there. They probably, if you look at, companies like Apple, Intel, Google, they do have this non-absolute language that, I have the knowledge of the universe and this is all clean code.
Yep. Yeah, in a related sort of area too. I mean, I'm just thinking about this because I have a conversation with some fintech companies coming up later today. But in the case of again, heavily regulated industries, when you're dealing with financial transactions, say processed over software, you often are asked to essentially, make sure that no one in your employ has been convicted of a, financial crime, or, a felony, or et cetera. There's a number of ways to kind of frame that, but it implicates, again, all of your employment contracts and your hiring processes. And so again, like a simple contract rarely is ever so simple.
Right. Yeah. Doing those background checks are important. And because there's lots of laws, even if you're a nonprofit, let's say I applied for a job being treasurer of a nonprofit. If I had like a gambling problem, that will disqualify me from being a member of the board or something like that. So you have to have some level of due diligence on where that comes for. Now, if people misrepresent and lie, that's one thing. But do you do a background check? I think you can do a background check for like $20 right now. Look at people's criminal records, and so I think it's pretty clear that we can have access to that information. And you may not want to do this for someone in a role that it doesn't matter, but certainly if they're high risk to the company, handling money, doing a certain technology with high risk, healthcare, aviation, those are things where you really want to make sure the individual's working on it, or you're hiring as an independent contractor or employee, that you have some level of knowledge of how they've worked in the past, for sure, to lessen your risk.
A lot of these terms we've talked about definitely put the onus on the contracting parties to essentially say, like, okay, we've done our due diligence, we know what's true, what's not, et cetera. I feel like I can't talk about tech these days without incorporating something related to AI. So, in the context of AI technologies, how given sort of so much of a black box AI technologies are these days, in some cases, like you can't actually, deconstruct how certain decisions were made by AI technologies. What does that do for some of these contractual terms, and how have you seen companies start to address some of those issues so far?
Yeah, it's a great term. I've been on the board of an AI company that does actually financial services called Complete Intelligence for years now, and they when you're looking at AI, that's like financial AI, which is different, say, on the LLMs and ChatGPT. And if you look at that, New York Times v. ChatGPT, Microsoft case, basically, the problem is training data for the LLM. So I have a LLM and I want it to be smart, so I will go and have it go to some sites and some sources and then bring back and aggregate the data and maybe synthesize the information. And the New York Times case is a seminal case that is pending right now, is basically New York Times saying, hey, that's our information, only subscribers can get to it. You're infringing or making a derivative work. It's a copyright infringement claim. The way to deal with this, I see in some of these contracts, are if you do have data on your website, you want to, in your terms of use are so important. People think, oh, click on terms of use. I agree. But if you're the company that's providing the data, your terms of use are very important. And you can say, no AI or LLM can have a license to use the data on this website to use for a training token or something. And you can actually have a contractual right saying, okay, by the fact that you're accessing my services and I'm providing them to you, that's an exchange, offer, acceptance, consideration. We have a contract. And part of those terms are, I don't want to be part of your training data. You can say that. Has this been litigated? No, but I'm telling people to think about that. The biggest thing with AI and the litigation around AI right now has to do with derivative works. Basically, there's 6 copyright rights, if you will, individual rights that the person who makes this expressive content owns. And one of those is the right to make derivative works, which is a work based on another work. For example, if I wanted to make, a movie, Gone with the Wind 5, or write a novel, Gone with the Wind 5, a series, well, I would need the original author or their estate, if it's still pending, their permission to do that derivative work based on it. And with AIs by their very nature make derivative works. And the argumentation goes, well, isn't everything under the sun derivative? Don't we get an inspiration from one musician and then it makes it into our song? And the issue is always to what degree? How much did you use? How much, quote, inspiration did you have to create that content? And it's already been litigated, by the way. AIs cannot own copyrights. They can't own intellectual property. That requires a human being.
Well, it's good to know that AIs can't own intellectual property.
Not right now, anyway.
Not yet, anyway.
Current case laws.
Give it time.
Yeah.
Martin, I've really enjoyed our time together here today, and I did want to mention that we've only scratched the surface in terms of some of these topics, and we're excited to be working with you as part of Tao Learning to put together a negotiation workshop in Q1, and wanted to put that out there that folks should keep an eye out for it, and that we'll be able to revisit a lot of these topics in much greater detail. And I wanted also, Martin, as we wrap up, like any sort of closing remarks, as it were, or some pearls of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things is that when you think about it, what we are able to negotiate determines the trajectory of our life. What job you get, what partner you have, how you try to negotiate with your teenagers to make good decisions. So negotiation is fundamental. And in the business context, people who are doing the deals really should know more about it, because I don't think about negotiation as kind of tricks and traps. I always say that negotiation is how we communicate our needs to the world. And if you're effective at negotiation, persuasion, and influence, your needs will be met. And that's what I think we should take away is it's about communicating effectively what you need in the transaction. And it's not about some tricks and traps which come up, and you definitely have to know how to handle them. But that's kind of my thoughts on negotiation and how fundamental it is to a career. And people who don't know how to do it definitely have regrets after the transaction, and they feel like they didn't do their best. And that's what I try to teach people, is how to do your best, how to leave nothing on the table. And we have a whole process, and it's very research based on how to do that.
Well, thanks again, Martin. It's been a pleasure spending time with you, and hopefully our listeners enjoyed it as much as I did.
All right. Thanks, Skip. I really appreciate the time.